All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning for some of our guests, and welcome to our June 2024 SAAL Structured Conversation. Before we start, we want to let you know that our session is being recorded today and closed captioning is available. My name is John Sayre. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Advising and Planning at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and I'm a member of the SAAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. SAAL and our committee are committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and identities in our offerings to meet your professional development needs. You can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal of your own, and you can find that information, how to do that on our structured conversation page, and I'm going to add that to the chat in case anybody wants to click on that and check out how to make a proposal. During this presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through the chat function, which we will be monitoring. And we'll be collecting up those questions to make sure that they get addressed as we progress. To get us started, please, all of our guests, if you'd put your please put your name, your role at your institution into our chat so our presenters can know who's in our audience today. All right. Now, to today's conversation. I hope you'll join me in welcoming our presenters, who are going to be joining us from various roles at various institutions from around the country. In just a moment, they'll be adding their names and roles to the chat as well. Our topic for today's discussion is what's next for assessment, insights from current graduate education practices. We have 7 presenters today on the panel, and as I said, they're going to be introducing themselves to the chat. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tori Rare for today's conversation. Tori?
Awesome. Thank you so much, John, and thanks to SAL for having us here. So this project, hopefully folks are a little familiar with it coming into this. If not, don't worry, we'll do a thorough review of it. It was essentially a collaborative project between SAL, the ACPA Commission for Assessment and Evaluation, and the NASPA Assessment, Evaluation, and Research Knowledge Community to look at syllabi from different assessment graduate courses in higher education and student affairs programs, and to essentially see what's going on in those courses and what can they tell us about the world of assessment, specifically in higher education and student affairs. We'll get more specifically into the methods and then the different findings from that project in a little bit. Obviously, that's why you're here. But just wanted to provide a little background in case you're coming into this not sure where the project is, where the project comes from. So if we could head to the next slide. So we do a little bit of this in the chat, but I wanted to make sure folks got a chance to introduce themselves. And at this point, we do have a lot of different presenters. Again, this was an amazing collaborative project from folks from all across the higher education community. So we are fortunate to have a large group for this project. But I want to invite the presenters to share their name, role, and institution. And then for folks who are also in the chat, if you could also share, you don't have to answer all 3 of these questions, but we'd love to know a little bit about what brought you to today's SAL structured conversation. If you have a favorite assessment project to date, we think that that's always exciting to talk about specifically within the context of this project. And then if you have any questions about what graduate training in higher education assessment looks like. So I'll go ahead and do my introduction while we wait for those chat responses to come in. My name is Tori Rare. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior analyst at Ohio State University in the Center for the Study of Student Life. I've been there in one capacity or another for about 4 years now. I've been a longtime member of SAAL, have really enjoyed the different professional development offerings. It was really critical to me when I first came into the higher education assessment field. So it feels like coming full circle to do this webinar today. And in terms of a favorite assessment project to date, I'm going to cheat a little bit. A lot of what I do in my role is program review, and I'm just going to say I love program review as a whole. But specifically, I really love program review when I get to work with departments like dining and our facilities programs that are not necessarily what we think of as like, traditional student affairs, but are really integral to the co-curricular experience that we offer on campuses. And I've really just learned a lot about higher education institutions through doing all of that. So that's been really exciting for me. And the questions that I have about graduate training and assessment, specifically coming into this project and what was the genesis for this project, which I know Jill will talk about in a minute, was just essentially like, what texts should I be reading? You know, what are the core authors in this field? And really just getting an understanding of, you know, are those the same across graduate programs? Are those different? You know, what are the core concepts that we really think of as, you know, higher education assessment? So I see some folks are introducing themselves in the chat. Thanks everybody for doing that. And yes, very excited about all the different offerings that folks are doing across the different professional associations. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Feel free to continue to interact in the chat throughout. One of the things I'll share about this project is that we have released a preliminary white paper. We have a manuscript in the works, but it's very much an evolving project. And so part of the reason we wanted to bring the SAAL community into this is to get folks feedback and to hear, you know, what findings are interested to you, what you're interested in learning more about, what remaining questions you have, because this really is a project that's, you know, growing and evolving. So please feel free to, you know, leave us that feedback in the chat as we go. The other thing I wanted to say before we started, and I'll plug in now, is I know quite a few people on this call contributed syllabi to this project. So I wanted to send a big thank you to everybody who did that. It was truly instrumental to have folks contribute their material. And I know folks put a lot of thought and effort into their syllabi. So thank you again just so much for sharing those materials with us. You know, truly, this project could not have come together without you. In terms of where we're focused today within this specific webinar, we're going to again be talking about the white paper with the preliminary findings from our first analysis, looking at these over 100 different syllabi from our higher education and student affairs assessment programs. So we're going to talk first about some common practices used in student affairs assessment graduate education, as well as some of the implications. And again, this is like preliminary. You know, we're growing and continuing to have these conversations, but the implications that the research team identified. And then we hope that you have a chance to foster connections with other folks who are interested. One of the things we've heard from this project is that folks are excited for using the findings in their syllabi moving forward. We very much hope that's a takeaway for a lot of folks here. So please do connect with each other, connect with us. We're happy to answer questions afterwards, and you know, we'll get into, you know, what the next steps will look like. And then I will go ahead and pass off to Joe to talk a little bit more about the origins of the project.
Hi, everybody. So this has been a really exciting project. I almost was a cheater and said this was a favorite assessment project just since it was so cool to bring together a lot of these organizations. But what really was the impetus for this is we've all been hearing questions from different populations. These are just a sample of them, right? But thinking about, what do I need to know about student affairs assessment, whether I'm a grad student or, you know, a new hire, or, you know, coming into the field, wanting to transition into the field, and then in leading the work or managing others, knowing what we should expect with respect to competency and knowledge of student affairs assessment, and thinking of what professional development should we be engaging in, or, you know, where should I be where might there be gaps? Because if all I know is all I know, I might think I understand assessment. And so where do I need to broaden my understanding, or, you know, what more do I need to know? And certainly for folks who are teaching others about assessment, what all should I be covering, and how, you know, what are hot topics? What are foundations? What are philosophical underpinnings? And, you know, I think a lot of this also, aside from that topic for assessment being relevant in general, there's also this lack of understanding for what that looks like for student affairs assessment, and how we couch that as part of the larger conversation around assessment as well. So the next slide then shows how we had multiple groups come together. You know, ACPA's Commission for Assessment and Evaluation, NASPA's Assessment, Evaluation, and Research Knowledge Community, and the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. We all had folks who were talking about this and thought, well, let's do something about this, right? Let's see what we can understand here. Let's get involved. And so we made a plan, and that started with us doing outreach through listservs and our networks to try and have folks share their syllabi so we could see what the current state looks like. We wanted to do this document analysis of the syllabi as a first step in this effort. In addition to our networks, we combed through NASPA's graduate program directory and did outreach, again, through the institutions of the people that we knew. We ended up getting 115 syllabi from 101 institutions, which was pretty cool. And what we also made sure to do in our outreach and in our follow-ups and reminders was we really tried to make it a representative sample. Just in case our networks were clustered, we made sure that we covered all the regions. And so we were very intentional in seeking out and engaging institutions from all the regions throughout the US in trying to get some content there. So then we divided among ourselves into multiple teams. And so I'm kicking off some of our findings. And so one of the teams really looked at what did the syllabi cover in terms of course description and focus. And these were the high level themes. You can see the course categories and then the number of syllabi, the percent of them, and the primary course topics. But the big themes were higher education assessment. So in general, what assessment looks like within the realm of higher education. Student affairs assessment specifically. And when that was included, it was more about foundational principles of the work. Research. There's a bit of that cross coverage with the first topic there, but how to go about research as a practice, ways to collect data, different techniques, program evaluation as well, where sometimes that's the sole focus of the course, or a big focus of the course as well. Classroom assessment as well, how to be doing assessment of student learning within the classroom. And the last big topic was equity-minded or equity-centered assessment, and thinking about how efforts, values, principles, and initiatives around equity contributes to benefits from, and can be a byproduct or promoted within assessment as a practice or being a vehicle to advance equity.
Hi, everyone. Continuing on. So researchers within this subgroup also searched for references to research methods and competencies or standards in course descriptions. 71 syllabi included a focus on research methods in their description. 66 of those syllabi mentioned both qualitative and quantitative or mixed methods, and the remaining 5 mentioned only quantitative. 41 syllabi referenced competencies or standards. The assessment, evaluation, and research competencies were most cited, followed by the CAS standards. The low number of references to our field's competencies is interesting, and as researchers, we're left wondering how the competencies are utilized in courses that reference them. Are instructors utilizing them to guide or outline course content? Are they taught in the course, or are they merely assigned as readings? That's just one limitation of our study that we identified. There are others, such as our inability to ascertain where the syllabi analyzed are contextually situated in a program's overall scope of study. We're curious about whether the course was required in the beginning, middle, or end of a program, if it was an elective or cross-listed with other departments, which might influence whether the course needed to be broad in scope, and if the syllabi was up to date given the limitations of our collecting methods. At times, it was also difficult to ascertain what codes the syllabi match, and there was no opportunity to follow up with instructors. For example, if the syllabi contain both qualitative and quantitative material, are the readers to assume a mixed methods approach was taken? And while the research team discussed coding with each other to discern where to place courses, a chance to reconnect with programs or more clarity in the syllabi would be beneficial for future research. And on our next slide, we get into learning outcomes, which was our next group of researchers. In total, 706 student learning outcomes were reviewed from 98 of 115 total syllabi. 17 syllabi did not include learning outcomes or objectives. The reviewers coded learning outcomes using the 13 content areas of the ACPA Ask standards, since they were created to specify the assessment competencies needed by student affairs practitioners, regardless of their role. Each student learning outcome was categorized into one standard, which captured the primary theme of that outcome. During this process, researchers noted many SLOs did not fit into the Ask standards content areas. And so we recorded these into emerging themes that captured topics such as the overall purpose of assessment in the field, exploring DEI in assessment work, students completing theory or literature reviews, establishing a culture of assessment, and accreditation. Student learning outcomes related to assessment design were most prevalent in the analyzed syllabi. This is unsurprising given that assessment design is an overarching outcome that captures the ability to articulate and execute an assessment plan at the program, service, unit, or divisional level. Effective reporting and use of results, selection of data collection and management methods were the next most prominent areas and categories. And many of the other categories we found to be purpose or method specific, including program review and evaluation, articulating learning outcomes and development outcomes, assessment instruments, surveys used for assessment purposes, interviews and focus groups used for assessment purposes, and benchmarking. Several themes such as assessment education, politics of assessment, culture of assessment, and accreditation might be considered only essential for those going into assessment specialist roles in the field. Throughout our process of review, we noted several limitations. Again, there was one reviewer per student learning outcome, so inter-rater reliability was not assessed. Some student learning outcomes cover multiple themes. However, we categorized the theme into whatever outcome the reviewer believed to be best fit for that objective. Some student learning outcomes were written in broad, general terms, requiring researchers to make assumptions about the instructor's specific objectives. Thus, the miscategorization or absence of a primary theme might not necessarily mean that the associated content was not covered in the course. And the courses were not all designed with the same intent or purpose. Some courses were solely dedicated in assessment, whereas others were a combination of topics, including assessment, research, program evaluation, institutional effectiveness, accreditation, and or quality assurance. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Natasha.
Yeah. So we had another group that looked at assigned texts, and I think you might now be getting a theme that it's a bit of a wide open playing field and that you can't really assume sort of a shared foundational knowledge that's coming out for professionals on assessment, and again, not one in the reading area. So in the review and looking at what are the syllabi or the texts that are required in the syllabi, there's not a commonly agreed upon text for introducing student affairs professionals to assessment. There are many texts that are used, 69% of syllabi, including unique text. So that's, it's a pretty cool amount. And I've been thinking too about just the wide nature of the scholarship and dialogue and assessment. That's also appropriate, I think. But over half of the courses did assign at least one of three main texts, which may or may not be familiar to you if you are an assessment person thinking about student affairs, assessment theory, and assessing student learning, a common sense guide. For these, it also is not surprising that you have sort of how to design, the research methods that would go along with that, which aligns very nicely with what you're hearing from the learning outcomes and the focus of the course. And so you would hope there would be alignment in an assessment course between objectives, what you're going for in a course, and the readings that are assigned. So there are some of those bases. But if we start to kind of look across all of these different areas and think about on the next slide, some of the common themes that we might have found from this, what can we say from looking across all these wonderful syllabi? And again, adding my thanks to Tori for sharing those. It's not likely that there's a common experience for assessment training. There were not standards routinely used, that courses aligned related to professional competencies needed either to engage in, understand, use, or be the assessment professional that's doing that work, that really led the course development or instructional design portion on it. Again, as Shiloh had mentioned, when they were used, it was not clear if it was mentioned that like this is aligned to, but it's not really clear how the standards played into that or not. Within the courses, the emphasis collectively across was really on designing assessments. Like if you're going to do an assessment, what do you need to know to design it and collect the data, over thinking about what's the political nature of assessment within a particular place, or even what do you do with all of this data when you have it? How can you think about the sense-making process or improve processes and practices in relation to it, but really more focused on the design element within that. And this may mean that professionals are not equipped with the sort of necessary fundamentals to navigate the landscape within a unit or an institution to really implement assessment work effectively. So we might have people that have plan knowledge, like I can make a plan, but it might be missing some fundamental things to have that plan really stick and make it work. It may also mean that assessment professionals come in and they're thinking about this in a much more rigorous research approach, with the focus on quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods being very emphasized in the courses, instead of thinking about, how do you adapt? What question should you answer? But if it was the course serving an assessment role or sort of a research methods function, was a bit of a blurring line. And lastly, courses were dependent upon the program in which they were housed. So by this, we mean if it was a counseling focused student affairs program, and that was kind of the history, the assessment class often focused on how do you choose an assessment in a counseling situation, versus in a higher ed, more focused, instead of a student affairs, maybe specific program, what is the role of assessment in higher education, broad landscape of assessment, accreditation, and program review, and all of that. So they are very programmatic specific, depending on the focus and emphasis of the program. So on the next slide, what does this all mean for you in your practice of assessment and student affairs, or for the faculty that I saw that were part of this, that are joining and are like, what do I need to be doing in my course as you're thinking about it? Well, we have some ideas, and these are ours and some, but I invite you to add your own into the chat, or questions that you might have. But for emerging professionals, assume partial knowledge. If you've had a course in assessment, you're started, but it's not the end of your journey. So if you're like, I've done assessment, there's more, and we invite you into the larger readings and sort of relevant professional competencies, as well as institutional specific guidance and policies that might not have been a part of your graduate program experience. Take a look at them, get involved, join things like SAAL, have conversations. The open course is a great place to engage in some of that as well. If you're a student affairs educator, be upfront about expectations and institutional context around assessment. Assessment really unfolds within a specific location and is often mediated by internal and external factors, like your institutional history with assessment, for example. So what matters to how assessment can be done, or how it may be done, matters within a specific place. So understanding role of place, I think, will be very helpful to doing that. But if you are an assessment professional, be prepared, more education is needed. So provide an assist and think about, particularly beyond the collection of data or development of an assessment plan, what professional supports can you provide to really help bolster the doing of that plan, the making sense of and using that data, and the really thinking about assessment as that continuous ongoing process. So focusing on interpreting and applying assessment findings. Really thinking like, what does this mean for us, our students here? What should we do based on who we are in this institution, and connecting that to sort of more relevant and ongoing pieces like AI and assessment, for example. But I'll pause there and say, Sean, what other implications do you have to share?
Thanks. Hey, y'all. So a couple other ones. So for faculty, when we looked at all the SLOs, they cover a lot of content. And in some cases, it seemed maybe not feasible to cover it all for a beginner all the way to mastery. So there is a need to align the prerequisites of a higher ed program to see what students are actually coming in with their assessment skills, and to focus what is covered on the skills that are most essential for the emerging professional roles that they would come to afterwards. So that was one thing we looked at. Also looking at the content itself, that some of the common books that you saw are 6+ years old, with a lot that has changed in that time. And the most popular book was updated this year, and one of our authors is on the call, but they recognize that the field is accelerating. So for example, they took out some of the sections related to data science, knowing that that would be out of date almost the minute it was published, and things like socially just assessment and how that's evolving in state legislature, and the increase in metrics and accountability. So there is a need to update content to address these topics and beyond the cycle of textbooks. So those are a couple of other things we saw for faculty. On the professional association side, which maybe we were talking to ourselves a little bit, is to provide some resource support. So practitioners have this expertise, right, to help align course content with essential competencies. So we saw, for example, in the SLOs that there were very little mention of the technical skills of survey and focus group design and administration. It was covered on an introductory level as part of, like Shiloh mentioned, just the general assessment design, that those are a type that could be used. But it didn't, most courses could not get into those details of how to do those pieces. So there's an opportunity for professional associations to supplement with these additional resources to practice those. Related is where students go from an assessment course that can't cover everything. So again, kind of a shameless plug to say, you know, reach out these course professors to supplement the courses with engaging students with practitioners who can provide, you know, current examples. Students always want to hear that. We joke with them when they say academic exercise, they say, oh, that's not a real thing, right? That's practice. And like, no, we want them to engage in a real activity, an assessment project that had context at a university, and learn from that. Also people in different roles. So it's not just full-time assessment folks. It can, you know, most of the people taking these courses are going into something that has it as a percentage of responsibility or other duties as assigned. And so being able to network with folks in those various roles and how they touch assessment will be helpful. But as Natasha said, these are our initial ideas. We welcome your implications. So with that, I am turning it over to Tanner for discussion.
Thank you, Sean. So we've shared a lot of things with you today, and a lot of things that we hope have got you thinking, and especially thinking about your own work and your own classes and students as well. But we want to turn it over to you to kind of engage us and engage each other about what we've shared and what you're thinking about. And so before we get into these questions, though, if you'll just take a few moments to scan this QR code, and you can save that in your tabs on your phone for later. But this will take you to a form that will allow you to type out some of the questions and answers and thoughts and all the good stuff that you're still having. And we'll be able to review that and kind of incorporate it into our future work and thinking, and hopefully address some of that for you. So once you've had a chance to scan the QR code, we do have some discussion questions for you, and that we hope can get us all thinking together. And we'll keep the screen shared so that you can see. I know Zoom for me updated today right before this. So I think I found out that there should be like a little 2-bar kind of thing between the screen share and the people. And if you want to drag the people over to see the people more, I always like to see more people who I'm talking with, if that's helpful. Feel free to turn your cameras on too if you're comfortable with that, but we encourage you to use the raise hand feature or pop some questions in the chat. Can you share the QR code link in the chat? Ooh, we have that somewhere. I think Paul might have that somewhere. He'll get that for you. Thanks for asking that, Steve. But we'll kind of turn it over to you. We don't really have an order of how we...
Thank you, Tanner. Certainly, we actually have some questions that have come through the chat, so let's take a moment to review some of those. Sonia was asking, and Joe, I'm going to turn to you. You've already responded to Sonia, but let's for the benefit of the larger group. Sonia was asking if there was, is there information about what classes these syllabi came from? and the types and locations of higher ed institutions that they were sourced from. Joe, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I was just alluding the appendix of our initial report, which I'll put in the chat again. We talked about the types of the institutions that these courses were almost exclusively from graduate programs, and then we give some tables and further breakdowns of the regions where we got the syllabi, and some other demographics. We were sensitive to what all we put in there because there were some faculty who were more than willing to share their syllabi, but did not feel comfortable with us disclosing their institution, their program. So we erred on the side of caution and to be conservative in the types of demographics and the way we broke down the institutional information in that initial report. But we do have some additional data like that, or could also further look at classifying the institutions by their institutional type, as a potential breakdown. Or jumping to another question, like we did capture the name of the degree for which the courses were in, and sometimes that was like the only degree offered, whereas other times it was, like I know some institutions have like a higher education degree, and there could be a higher education administration track, a student affairs track, or what have you. And so there were things like that again, we would maybe discuss or talk about among ourselves and maybe make notes of, or realize for some institutions, but not others, but can be more pieces for us to further dig into. But I think initially we were trying to be sensitive to how it was a variety of willingness to share information about the institutions. So we shared a couple breakdowns to start.
Great, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Doctor. And Erica, I think Erica was also kind of speaking to that, and I think you addressed that in regards to the program types that the source, the material, the syllabi came from. So thank you for that. I have an additional question here. This work focused, this is from Julie, and her question is, this work focused on graduate programs. Do we have a sense of what percentage of student affairs professionals engage in graduate work and would be exposed to classes like these? What recommendations do you have for how those who engage in this type of learning can share it with their institutions?
I think that's a really great question. I don't know a percentage off the top of my head in terms of folks who are coming from, higher education and student affairs programs, what percent they make up of the, total student affairs and higher education workforce. But what I will say is one of the limitations that we recognize of this project is that there are a lot of folks from outside of, what we think of as traditional higher education and student affairs graduate programs who are working in our department and our institutions in these sort of co-curricular roles. So, this can't speak to the training that every single person has, but first I think what this project does help to do is it identifies, again, what are the topics, the texts, the core learning outcomes that are being covered in those courses, so folks who don't necessarily have a HESA background can then go and seek out additional professional development on their own. So we, as well as for folks who are in these assessment roles, one of the questions I had coming into this project is I interact a lot with folks who are not in a full-time assessment role, but who are interested in conducting assessment. And so this project helped me get a better idea of, for somebody who graduated from one of those higher education student affairs programs, what knowledge might they be walking into that conversation with? What expectations might they have from that conversation? As well as from somebody who's who didn't come out of a HESA program, what are some resources that I can share with them? Where are some different places that I can point to them that are sort of the, core knowledge within this field? But if anybody else in the panel has ideas, feel free to jump in.
Anyone else?
I'll just add sort of this is not related, but go with me on the thinking. Go with me on this journey. So one of the things I think that was really interesting as we think of the sort of the role of graduate programs in supporting our student affairs professionals is there were quite a few when we were going through this process and reaching out and saying, hey, do you have a syllabi that were either entirely revamping their curriculum and going through a large scale revision and sort of re-relevancy, maybe we'll say process. There was also several that had paused enrollment and were unclear when they would be opening that back up. And a smaller group that were like, we're done and we're not having these anymore. And so I think too, the question on sort of what percentage do we have coming through this is also, you know, do we need to be sending some professionals at certain points of time when they get to a certain area to be like, there are these really awesome programs that can give you these knowledge and skills and tools, and here are these available opportunities for you? Or do we need to be thinking about kind of the role of the graduate programs and student affairs journeys, particularly in relation to assessment? I would argue, because that's my bag, but
I'll also add to what Natasha said, and this gets back to the question that Dr. Eckert asked as well. I was part of the group that looked at institutions' websites to see, you know, where a course was in terms of progression within a graduate degree. Was an assessment course even offered? And at least for me, as I was going through those institutional websites, the line between what was like a higher education administration versus student affairs versus, you know, like assessment focused degree became very muddy in terms of, I think that the title for degrees are oftentimes encompass very diverse courses and sometimes not necessarily what you would think. So something that would be like a student affairs program might include, just based off of the institutional context, might include like a huge focus on social justice and power dynamics, versus at a different institution, there might be a much heavier focus on data and assessment. There might be a multi-sequence assessment course, or excuse me, a multiple courses within an assessment sequence. So I think that is almost like a separate research project in terms of, you know, what is the course progression through higher education and student affairs programs? What is like a student affairs versus higher education programs? It all feels like almost more muddy to me once we started this research project, which I think is what happens a lot of time with research. Sometimes it gets a little bit murky before it gets clear. But yeah, definitely some interesting pieces in terms of there were some, you know, common thoroughfares between these, but a lot did differ by institutional context.
Great. Great. Just want a quick update for everybody. Javon asked in the chat about the online open course, and it looks like there's going to be another session coming back in January, early February 2025. So if that's something that's of interest to you, Joe has added in the chat the link to the course page. So please make note of that if that's something that's of interest to you. So thanks for bringing that up, Javon. All right. Are there any other questions from the group? Tanner, I think you mentioned that you had some prompts for the audience. Am I right about that? Yes. Would you like to lead us through a discussion?
Yeah, we have ample time. So if anyone still had any, thoughts that they wanted to discuss as the larger group, or any other questions, still feel free to send them through the chat as you have been throughout the presentation. Raise your hand and talk and unmute, or fill out the form if you want to just send us some questions. So just open the floor.
I have a curiosity for the panel. Were you able to determine by syllabus? I don't know if this is possible, but were these courses, or even do you believe that at least one course of assessment for student affairs, or future student affairs professionals, people that are in these related fields of study as graduate students, that learning assessment should be a part of a required part of the curriculum, specifically a required part? I don't know that all programs do, and I wonder if there would be any merit to that. It would seem to me that most institutions have some kind of student affairs assessment going on, and it seems practical to me, at least, that people who have advanced degrees in the related fields, while they may not have it be a large portion of their job duties, once they're in the profession, that they should be knowledgeable about how to interact with it, how to support it at their institutions or within their divisions. I wonder if anyone has any opinion about that, or if they saw that was the case, that most of these programs are requiring that type of curriculum.
I'm happy to comment on this and as other people think and get some time in. So we did look at if a course was required or was an elective, and I will say it's a bit of a mixed bag on whether or not it's in what the program focus is or what the course focus is, whether it was required or elective. I think more often in a doctoral program it was elective than in a master's. Don't quote me on that. I have to go back and look at the data again. But I do think I strongly question the potential to get people to a knowledge of assessment that we wanted in these syllabi, that you could see in a course. That's like from when you come in with let's say you have no background or knowledge of assessment in the span of a course, and some of these ranged from like 8 weeks to 16, I mean, it's across the board on that too, in length of time. No knowledge to being like, develop a plan that you think is really going to get you to these things. So it's like, maybe it's more you could evaluate an existing plan and what kind of questions do you have or what struggles would they run into. But like, can you really get to a place for students where they have a solid understanding of assessment in a course? I'm not sure. I wonder if we're asking too much in a course. I would argue it's something that we should have embedded throughout courses across the graduate program. So in different points in time, if I'm taking a course on finance, where does assessment fit into budget conversations? And how do I need to be thinking about this? If I am, in a student development course and I'm really looking at that, like what's the role of assessment and how does this fit? And so by pulling it out, and I don't know, I'm not speaking at all for the group on any of this, so I definitely invite others to comment and take a completely different stance. But I think it becomes like, here's how you do this practice, and it's separate from these other things that you're learning, as opposed to how this can be an embedded part of our ongoing processes. And if we're designing an initiative, like where does assessment fit in that or not? And I don't know. We didn't see any that were infused throughout. We weren't really looking for that per se, so maybe there are a couple that are programs that are falling under the radar on that, but very interested to hear what others think, and the faculty who are teaching these courses too, their thoughts on that.
I'll add that, I mean, one, we're the choir, right? We're all assessment folks and thinking of it from that lens. So I'll state the obvious that we do see the value of it. But one of the things we're looking at with implications is the ACPA and ASPA competencies and the update that's in process to look at those, what is needed in the field, right? Whether you're an assessment professional or just a general student affairs practitioner. And this has been on the list and is going to continue to be on that list. Back to Natasha's point, though, the initial framework of it is such a tall order to have all of these skills in the competency when you read it. Like, who has that? I mean, we have, I'm full-time doing this role and I read those, like, I don't have all of the assessment ones. So it's something that we're taking a look at. I'm thinking of the work Paul and I did last year with the Assessment Institute and trying to reframe at least tiers of development based on role types. So if assessment's other duties as assigned, maybe back to one of Natasha's points, that you would be more of a critical assessment consumer than be expected to be able to do a really robust study. But those are some of the things that we're thinking about in the implications for this, is how to inform the competencies to be realistic. And, Joe was talking about the SAAL course, also all the folks that do not have this coursework. It wasn't around when they went through their school, or it wasn't required. And so these are not the only way that they are or should be learning these skills.
I would just also like, not to take it in a different direction, but I think it's the question begs a larger question around practice. And, you know, we have ACPA, NASPA competencies that assessment's expected as a student affairs professional, right? That's an expected competency. And yet, we also know there are still many institutions who don't do student affairs assessment. That is a reality. I can tell you as a consultant, because I get hired by the schools to help jumpstart their efforts. Like, it is a more prevalent reality than people realize. And that's even in the face of accreditation requirements. Accreditors are getting better at calling for this work. However, much like there can be some misnomers and lack of consensus among student affairs professionals, the accreditors are even worse. And so I've been at accreditation conferences where they will say things like, the best thing you can expect for student affairs assessment is a survey. And so institutions can get really mixed messages of what assessment is if that's what they're hearing from their accreditor, and if they're only doing it because their accreditor told them they had to. And then if you think that's their understanding, then they might question, well, why would we have a course on that? Or if we're going to have a course on it, then all we need to do is talk about surveys. So, you know, for me, what I think is really interesting about the insights here is to take a step back and think of the landscape and the implications of what this looks like. And as was discussed, that, you know, there's a lot of people who come into student affairs related roles who haven't been in a graduate program, let alone what, you know, whether the program's an elective or required course. They weren't even in a student affairs or higher education grad program. You know, they came from another profession. They came from another industry. They came from a different background. So yeah, there's big implications for not only the graduate preparation space, but then also what do institutions need to be aware of, and assessment professionals be aware of, and our professional organizations be aware of to know where these gaps are and to help fill them, as well as reinforce what's already there.
Thank you. Thank you. One excellent discussion. I very much appreciate it. We've got another question in the chat here. Jess is asking, did it overall seem like equity-focused courses and assessment-focused courses were orthogonal to each other in general cases, as opposed to being inherently dependent on each other?
That's a really great question. We did not necessarily look at where assessment courses fit in within like a sequence of other courses. We were the data we just looked at were the assessment courses required, or were they optional as part of the degree program? So I don't think we can necessarily speak to the relationship of assessment courses to equity courses. What I will say is that one of the things we noticed is that there was a trend within the syllabi of a focus on the interplay between assessment and equity focused and equity minded assessment. So that was coming across within the syllabi that we looked at, but unfortunately, I don't think that we can say, you know, how the assessment courses are related to equity courses, but definitely an interesting question to look at in the future.
Thank you. Dean asked, was there thought about extending the survey to now track the students and see where they go, what professional roles they take on after the course? And Dr. Levy clarified that their effort was a document analysis, and that they did not survey students for information on that topic, but acknowledges that would be a really cool next step. Now that they have the syllabi covered, and to exchange with students and current professionals about the courses that they've taken or are involved in. So there may be more to come from this, from the work from this working group. So that's very interesting. Good to know. All right. We have let's see, who would, I beg your pardon.
We just wanted to share some next steps. And so, John, you just kind of gave a great segue into that. So we do have a forthcoming journal article in the Journal of Student Affairs, Inquiry, Improvement, and Impact that will be out in December. And so we are working on that as I speak. And we are on the roadshow sharing findings. So we shared this at ACPA. We're sharing this here, and we are also looking at how we can conduct further analysis on our findings versus, required, non-required, optional, disaggregating it by degree type, master's versus PhD or terminal degrees. And so that QR code that Tanner shared and that Shiloh shared the link to in the chat, if you have other ideas and questions, feel free to fill that out. And we are looking forward to responding to the new competencies that Sean brought up in 2025, I think they come out. And so I hope many of you participated in those focus groups earlier this year. And so we anticipate looping back around when those are published next spring. And then if you want a copy of the slides, and if you also want the copy of the white paper, you can email the Commission for Assessment Evaluation, ACPA email. We are more than happy to send you that. We can also coordinate with SAAL to send out those materials with the registration list. So that's all we have.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make sure that there are just a couple more points from the chat before we go. Darby made mention that students are more excited about taking her class today than they were a decade ago. And to speak to one of Joe's points, they're sometimes considered an expert on the campus they are visiting after just one class. So I think that speaks to our conversation earlier about the critical nature of including assessment teaching or assessment education in graduate programs. And I think, let's see, Sarah mentioned it would be really interesting to get data regarding the profession's feeling about standards and competencies. It would also be interesting to see where programming skills are taught in relation to assessment. So maybe that could be something that the group works into their future steps. That would be great to learn more about as well. All right. If there aren't any other questions or comments, as we conclude our session today, I just want to thank all of our presenters. What a wonderful conversation. These structured conversation events are always a success because of the high quality professionals that we have presenting. So thank you to all of you for your time and for the work that you're doing in this area regarding graduate programs. So I'd like to thank the committee for bringing, once again, bringing this structured conversation to fruition. We will have a recording of our session today available on our page, along with the associated materials and some of those links that were, or rather, all of those links that were added. We've made record of those, and we'll be sharing those as well. So I think the last thing to do is to plug our next, event, which will be with Dr. Will Miller on July 10th, where Dr. Miller will be taking us beyond the classroom, elevating student success through holistic assessment of learning and life. So we hope that you will also join us for that session on the 10th of July. I think if I misspoke a moment ago, the 10th of July. So I believe that concludes our activities for today. So thank you everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at future structured conversations.